Hello everyone! Last month I made another custom Super Mario Bros. Wonder level, once again using the Fushigi level editor. My inspiration for this level's mechanics actually partially came from a YouTube comment I got, suggesting I combine Hobbycat and on-off blocks, since Hobbycat could be made to trigger on-off switches every time the player jumps. However, on-off blocks in Super Mario Bros. Wonder make use of a hard-coded collision type, which means it's currently impossible for custom levels to be made using them. So instead, I decided to use on-off tracks. The original game only uses that mechanic once in the World 6 airship, so I figured it had a lot of untapped potential. If I was going to use tracks, I would also need things to go on those tracks, which is why I decided to use basic moving platforms and Pokepedes. I originally wanted this to be a sky level, but I realized that the setups I wanted to do would require a lot of terrain and ceilings and stuff like that, which doesn't really mesh well with a sky-themed level. So instead, I decided to make it an underground level. If that sounds familiar, that's the exact same train of thought that led me to making my previous level an airship level instead of a sky level as well. Hopefully someday I'll finally get around to actually making that sky level. Anyways, now it was time to start working on the level. This is going to be a bit of a downer way of starting things off, but I have to say, working on this level has been the most frustrating Super Mario Bros. Wonder modding related thing I've done. There were just so many ideas I had ahead of time that didn't work out, because of finicky setups, glitchy enemies, and other stuff like that. It was honestly quite a demoralizing experience. I usually work on these custom levels in roughly 2-hour chunks, where I record the time-lapse for around 90 minutes and spend the other 30 doing off-camera playtesting and tweaking. However, throughout most of this level's creation process, I would instead spend 90 minutes tweaking and testing things, trying to get stuff to work, which left me with 30-minute recordings of the actual level creation process. The fact that the time-lapse still ended up being as long as usual also shows how I probably spent more time on this level than any other thus far. I'm not kidding when I say it might have been 30 hours of work. Having said all that, the level still turned out fine. I really should have just tested my ideas out more thoroughly ahead of time. Anyways, that's enough self-pity. So let's actually talk about the level's design. Hobbycats are both very simple and yet also very dynamic enemies. They can move in 4 directions and hit blocks. The player has control over them, but they're also an obstacle. They really are a lot of fun to work with. On the other hand, I can't say I'm too big of a fan of Pokepedes. First of all, I don't really like their design, or even their name for that matter. I mean, they're called Pokepedes, and yet clearly they're some kind of wiggler. But really, it just comes down to the fact that they're stuck moving along predetermined tracks, and yet their defining characteristic is destroying blocks, something that ideally the player should have control over. Therefore, using them in combination with on-off tracks really is the only way I can think of making them an actually interesting and dynamic enemy the way Hobbycats already are by default, because now the player actually has control over them, meaning they can still be a generic enemy that damages you if you're not careful, but they can also help you out by clearing a path depending on your actions. There are quite a few levels throughout the original game that barely feature any normal terrain tiles. They mostly rely on objects like pre-made semi-solids or pipes. That isn't how I usually design my levels. However, I decided to try and mimic that style for this level, and I think it turned out pretty good. I suppose in a way, this is my first custom Super Mario Bros. Wonder level that features an auto-scroller section. It's not a true auto-scroller, it just sort of functions as one because you ride a platform throughout the last section before the midway flag. Something that I used to worry about quite a bit when it came to designing autoscrollers was preventing the player from getting stuck by jumping onto some other part of the level and leaving the moving platform behind. However, just like most Mario games, the autoscroller levels in Super Mario Bros. Wonder do next to nothing to prevent this. So I just sort of accepted that yes, it is possible to get stuck in the autoscroller section, but whatever. By the way, you may have noticed that Fushigi, the Super Mario Bros. Wonder level editor, is looking a little different these days. That's actually because a guy named Charles Dev has made a fork of the editor, basically his own continuation of where others left off with the program, so it's had a lot of major updates over the past few weeks. Probably the most notable new feature is the addition of copying and pasting, including being able to control-click any object to duplicate it, which has made level creation significantly faster. Another notable addition is something that I actually suggested myself, which is that different types of objects now have different box colors in the editor, which is a very simple but effective way of making each object easier to distinguish. So whereas previously the start of most levels was cluttered with all these bright green boxes that belong to the objects that are used for background elements, those now show up in dark blue, which is way less distracting and also makes it easier to know which objects you should actually be paying attention to. The end of the autoscroller section is also where I combine Hoppycats and on-off blocks for the first time. So the player has to jump to make the Hoppycat hit the on-off block, which in turn switches the track the player moves along. For the level's midway flag, I originally wanted to bind the flag to a moving platform, since there is a version of the midway flag that can be bound to match the movement of other objects. However, this feature seems to be broken, or at least it didn't work for the moving platform, since although the model would move with the platform, the actual collision of the flag stayed behind, which made it unusable. For the second half of the level, I originally wanted to introduce this gimmick where the on-off blocks would reverse the direction of the platforms moving along the tracks. I remember this being a thing that on-off blocks did in one of the original game's enemy arena levels, so I tried to copy that setup over to my own level. However, I just completely misremembered that section in the original game, because the on-off blocks don't reverse the direction of the platforms, they just stop them from moving altogether. I only realized my mistake after the section was already finished, so I was sort of going through the 5 stages of grief before finally accepting that the section would have to be partially remade, which you'll see me doing later on. Pokepedes didn't end up playing a big role in the second half of the level because I discovered that the wonder effect I wanted to use didn't work with them at all. So that's why I basically have the ultimate setup related to that mechanic here so early on in the second half of the level. I knew I wouldn't really be able to use Pokepedes much beyond this point. Originally, I wanted this level to feature at least one background bonus room, maybe even 2, but in the end you'll see it actually doesn't feature any. Hoppycats don't jump when they're in a different level layer than the player, so there wasn't a way of replicating the level's first bonus room using a background area, and sadly, tracks won't render in background areas, meaning the idea I had for a bonus room where the player would control a Pokepede's movement by using on-off tracks also couldn't be a background area. Apart from it just being a cool aesthetic thing, I wanted to include background areas because both of the original game's levels that use this theme also featured 2 background areas. The wonder effect for this level was something that I hadn't fully figured out until it actually came down to implementing it into the level. I had sort of come up with this vague idea of using the slow motion wonder effect, mostly because I liked the idea of forcing the player to run under a bunch of Hoppycats that would slowly jump up and down. But still, I didn't just want to settle for slapping slow motion onto an otherwise pretty simple section, which is basically what Nintendo did in the original game. So that's why I came up with using the slow motion effect in combination with the on-off blocks, where hitting the block would basically turn the entire wonder effect off. It's not like on-off blocks can be made to just turn any wonder effect off, especially not things like transformations, but the reason this worked for the slow motion effect is that it's its own object separate from the wonder tag. There's also this handy object that sends out a signal every time an on-off block is hit, so I just linked that to the slow motion effect, and it worked. There is a funny trick I pulled that Nintendo actually did themselves as well, which is that the player isn't slowed down to the same extent as the rest of the world. In the case of my wonder effect, the player is 70% of their normal speed, but other elements are at only 25% speed. But I wouldn't be surprised if most people don't even notice that. This discrepancy isn't just useful for making the section not as slow and boring, it also means that hitting the on-off blocks actually sort of changes the player's abilities. If the player slowed down just as much as the world around them, then that wouldn't really make jumping on platforms that much easier, apart from an increase in reaction time. But since the player isn't slowed down as much as those platforms, you basically have increased agility and speed and control and stuff, at least relative to the world around you, which makes hitting the on-off block actually worthwhile. In fact, if anything, the main thing I worried about when it came to designing this section was making the player hit the on-off block to turn the slow motion off. Really, the only reason to do this is to speed up the section a bit, as opposed to having to wait for the enemies or platforms to move around for ages, which essentially solves the problem of the original game's slow motion section, which is that it was kind of boring. I also decided to include a few of those big Hoppycats, which were the wonder effect for the original game's first Hoppycat level, mostly just because I wanted an enemy that the player couldn't just defeat with some fireballs. It also made it to where the block breaking mechanic of the earlier part of the level was still sort of integrated, even if the Pokepedes couldn't be. Actually, have I even mentioned that yet? Yeah, so Pokepedes just instantly die during the slow motion wonder effect, meaning I couldn't use them for my wonder section, which is something I only realized as I started working on it. The same also goes for platforms that move horizontally in any way, since that horizontal momentum seems to get multiplied, which launches the player. It's really weird. That basically meant that I had to design this whole second half of the level without two of the main mechanics that I had set up in the first half, which was a challenge to say the least. The finale of the level's build-up of gimmicks and ideas, of course, was to have a Hoppycat hit the on-off block that toggled the slow motion effect, which made for quite a hectic final section. This new Fushigi version has also finally solved probably the most annoying bug that persisted throughout every version of the editor previously, which is that half the time you'd place terrain, the editor would just crash. That's also made it to where editing this time-lapse didn't take as much time for me, since I didn't have to edit out the usual 50 times where the editor would crash. I was so focused on making the wonder effect segment cool on its own, that I temporarily decided to ignore how the section should work without the wonder effect. Which meant that when it was time to make the non-wonder version of that part, this was also quite a challenge. The one ace up my sleeve was that I could use the Pokepedes here instead, since obviously the section wouldn't feature any slow motion without the wonder effect activated. The wonder tag object can spawn or despawn any other object in the game, so I even did some funny stuff where the section sort of changes structure depending on whether you grab the wonder flower by spawning or removing extra pipes. Whether you grab the wonder flower or not, at least I also managed to integrate a Pokepede into the devil's goal pole setup, meaning at least that mechanic isn't entirely missing from the intended version of the second half of the level. At this point, we're getting close to the level being done, but as usual, I didn't record me adding in the talking flowers, but I did actually want to say something about those. Since this level uses the on-off switches, it only made sense to include the red and blue on-off talking flowers. However, including these led to a bit of a puzzle for me, because it basically meant that I had to find not one, but two completely different and yet appropriate lines for every talking flower. Since the position and style of the talking flower's speech bubble is hard-coded, I also had to make sure those matched for each pair of lines I chose. I did kind of cheat by having a few normal talking flowers in the level, in parts where there were no on-off blocks, even though the original game's on-off block level didn't do that. But either way, finding the right lines for each pair of talking flowers took a long time. One of the last things I did for the level was figure out the lighting for the wonder effect. Super Mario Bros. Wonder has this really cool system that you probably observed during some of its levels, where the lighting of an area can dynamically change very quickly. So I used the object that does that to change the lighting every time the slow motion effect was activated during the wonder effect. I wanted the lighting to match the red and blue on-off blocks, so I actually made the lighting files for that myself. Anyways, I'm adding in the final bits of decoration now, so I suppose it's time to check out the level in-game. Okay, and here we are. So I wanted to introduce Hoppycats in a bit of a different way, which is why I made that invisible question mark block setup there. Even though I suppose it could be argued that, like, that's not really the level's central mechanic or anything. I don't really do much more with that idea, but I think it's just a funny way of sort of, yeah, reversing what you might think of Hoppycats as from the original game. Anyways, we have a bunch of different coin secrets here towards the start of the level. We had the one with the pipes there earlier, and also, I guess, another one with the pipes here. Those are also pipes. Yeah, that's basically just me experimenting with different ways of distributing secrets to the player, I suppose you could say. Here for the first lucky 10 coin, which is what the internal file name for the big purple coins is, we have this little Pokepede redirection puzzle, I guess, where it's actually very simple, but considering it's like the first secret in the level, or at least the first major secret, I think it's fine. And then here we have one of those, I know I've got a lot of comments saying these are like very Kirby-esque bonus rooms. I think what people are trying to say with that is just that they're good bonus rooms, because most Super Mario Bros. Wonder bonus rooms aren't really that elaborate. Whereas I guess in Kirby games that usually is the case, and so I've seen a lot of people saying like, oh, these bonus rooms are just like Kirby, and like, I guess so, but I think that just means that like they're good. And I guess they also make creative use of like directing enemies, I suppose. Speaking of creative use of enemies, I really like what I did there with that the pipe pushing that Hoppycat down there. It's just a funny little way of combining two of the level's mechanics, because, yeah, sort of accidentally, I suppose, this whole, like, moving pipe thing did end up becoming a bit of a central-ish mechanic in the level, and I think that's mostly just because the original swamp levels also did that. Anyways, here we have this, yeah, this very forgiving on-off block section, because it wouldn't feel right to just dump the player in the poison water there if they didn't quite get what to do here, because it is still quite early on in the level, and also that would be like an instant kill, which, yeah, just seems unfair. And that's also, for example, why here with this this jumping section, that's only like for a secret. I didn't want to rely on the player actually fully understanding that gimmick right away. But yeah, we also have a funny talking flower down there, and once again, like I talked about just a little bit ago, I had to really like curate what kind of talking flower lines I would have to like pick for each talking flower, because they had to match for like the blue and red versions, and it was a whole thing. Anyways, this is a section that I had to redesign because I mistakenly thought that the on-off blocks could reverse the direction of the platforms, which just wasn't the case. So instead we have this another one of those setups with the moving pipes. And speaking of which, these power-ups here can also be gotten with the moving pipe stuff, and I guess that's sort of the final thing I do with those, really. And yeah, speaking of final things I do with stuff, there is like the big major Pokepede section for the second half of the level, which is all just one big Pokepede going around this section here. I did hide some coins down here, which is kind of misleading because the actual secret that's hidden in this section here is of course hidden up there. And I do hope people will understand that that's a pipe you can actually go into. Sadly, you can't recolor pipes in this particular theme. They have to be this like bluish teal color. So yeah, I couldn't really make the bonus room stick out in that way. Anyways, I'm talking so much I've already cleared the bonus room. By the way, depending on which like state you leave the on-off block at, that will actually affect the wonder section that's coming up. Because I left it as off in this case, which means that if I grab the wonder flower here, you'll see that the wonder effect actually starts out in its blue state, which is where the slow motion effect isn't activated. But if I had left the block on the whole time, back in the bonus room here, then that would have also started the wonder effect as on, with the slow motion effect activated. Which I think is really interesting, honestly, and it's like, I'm sure it's not even really something that most people will think about, but that is something I had to consider for my, for designing this, basically. And it also meant that I had to kind of sort of fudge the way the wonder, like, palette transition usually works. But yeah, it's a bit complicated, and I can't really fully explain it myself, honestly. Anyways, here I want to sort of encourage the player to like stop these platforms at an appropriate place for you to then jump across them, which is why I think using the on-off blocks is actually a good thing, because otherwise you'd have to wait for a very long time. However, throughout most of the rest of the level, honestly, keeping the slow motion effect active the whole time is probably the smartest thing to do. It's mostly just if you're, I guess if you're impatient like me, that you'd have to turn the on-off blocks back off for a little bit. Those coins there, and in general in this section there are some coins you can spawn that like will just basically instantly fall into the poison water, especially if you don't have the slow motion turned on. But I think that's okay, and I mean the original slow motion effect in the original game also did have a lot of those like sort of gravity affected coins all over the place, mainly just to sort of highlight the fact that I guess there is slow motion going on. Anyways, yeah, that final section there, it's actually very easy to do that. You just have to basically spam jump the whole time, and that's also what I'm doing here, and yeah, that's the wonder section already done. I like here how I turned the big Hoppy Cat into a small Hoppy Cat here. That just feels like a very, I don't know, just a very cute kind of thing to do, even though I did just murder him, I suppose. And yeah, I guess we're basically at the end of the level now. Over here we have the goal pole setup, which combines, I guess you could say, the level's two main mechanics, even though, like I've talked about, Pokebees don't really show up much towards the end. But before we wrap things up, we should check out the wonder section without the wonder effect actually active, I guess. Okay, so here we are, and there's the wonder flower, and yeah, we're just going to skip that. There is a talking flower that shows up in the wonder effect, that's an on-off talking flower, and as you can see here, that's actually just a normal talking flower that sort of hints at the fact that you've skipped the wonder flower. And those pipes up there to the left there are actually, those don't spawn normally, and those upside down Hoppy Cats also don't, and these moving platforms don't, and like that Hoppy Cat doesn't, and this whole thing here where you have to hit this Wonder Bud, and yeah, as you can see, I basically just made this section completely different if you don't grab the Wonder Flower. Obviously, I also didn't spawn the big Hobby Cats. This Pokebeat actually punches through the same like blocks that the one of the big Hobby Cats also jumps through, but there's some pipes missing, so it feels like a completely different section basically. It's actually quite cool. I suppose this platform here is kind of similar to what's there in the Wonder Effect as well. And there's also some like coin secret up there, just like during the Wonder Effect. But we also have another Pokebeat here because, yeah, I didn't have to worry about those glitching out like during the Wonder Effect. I suppose if you did play through this level without getting the Wonder Flower, then that coin circle back there, like, it doesn't really fit in because it's kind of just purposeless, but whatever. But yeah, we're back at the goal pole now, so that's it for this video, guys. I hope you enjoyed. If you did, make sure to leave a like and maybe consider subscribing, or maybe check out the Wonderland Discord server, which is linked in the description. But thank you guys so much for watching, see you later, and bye bye!